Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you happen to be. Everybody, I hope you're having a great week. And more importantly, I suppose, I hope you are actually enjoying this course and the content that is being covered. Today I'm wearing my very special shirt that was given to me for Christmas, which says, "Warning, may start talking about history." And that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. We are going to talk about the decade of the 1920s. This is a really important and unique decade, and in fact, some of what occurs during the 1920s is still having an impact upon the United States to this very day. Many of the societal and cultural changes that occurred after World War I are practices that are embedded in American society. You know, for example, the way in which people began to engage in dating type relationships that really changed during the 1920s, where before folks would engage in a practice called courtship, that began to change towards a more traditional style dating practice. And a lot of that was facilitated by innovation, particularly the automobile, which gave folks the ability to leave their homes and go out to a date. There was more expendable income in the 1920s. People could go out and purchase to have a good time, whether they're going to the speakeasy or the jazz club or what have you. And some of those changes are very much embedded in our society today. But the decade of the 1920s is, in some respects, very bewildering because what you find is a deep tension that's going to exist between the oncoming of modernity and modernism itself, and the desire by many to hold on to traditional ways of life, traditionalism. And in fact, some historians refer to the 1920s as an exact tension between modernity versus traditionalism. And we're going to see that throughout the 1920s. And, you know, when we talk about the 1920s, when we think about the 1920s, oftentimes we think about mass production, mass consumerism, and indeed, advertising itself becomes a very major institution in the United States at this time. In fact, the United States is producing, I think, upwards to about 50% of the world's manufactured goods in the 1920s, and the economy is just clipping along. The United States, when you compare it to every other country in the world, it seems to be doing extraordinarily well. And in large measure, this is particularly true when you compare it to against nations in Europe, because World War I destroyed and wrought massive havoc upon countries throughout the rest of the world. But for the most part, physically speaking, the United States went unscathed. And so in the post-war period, the economy in the United States is doing very, very well. The farm industry is not doing very well. In fact, farmers are doing quite poorly at the time. I'm trying to find here a reading. It says, while the urban middle class prospered, farmers suffered as the wartime boom in exports of grains and livestock to Europe ground to a halt. 4 million people moved from farms to the cities, in part because of the better quality of life and in part because of the prolonged agricultural recession. In fact, one of the major changes we're going to find in the 1920s is there is a rising middle class, and there will be more people beginning to move towards urban centers as opposed to rural centers. But perhaps the thing that we think most about when we contemplate the 1920s is the Jazz Age, the ballyhoo years, the Roaring Twenties. All of these terms are, of course, given to describe this decade. And what that sort of reflects is kind of a new, carefree, modern society, one that is punctuated by excess, one that is punctuated by sexual expressions, and a new attitude about gender and sexuality and relationships between men and women. This is indeed reflected in the quote-unquote new woman, who is epitomized by the flapper, an individual who sort of threw off the constraints of the Victorian society, and they began to embrace a more modern approach. These type of women did things that their mothers and grandmothers would have been appalled by. They are smoking, they are drinking, they are swearing, they're driving automobiles, they are exerting a level of independence over themselves and their sexuality in a way that Victorian mothers never would have done. In fact, for those of you that are interested in the politics of fashion and the meaning of fashion, when you take a look at the fashion of the flapper, you find that it stands in stark contrast to the fashion of the Victorian era. The Victorian era woman wore these corsets, which of course, were constricting, and they caused the body to turn into an hourglass so that the woman had the figure, right? Oftentimes you have these big hats, and they're very large and constraining and layered. By contrast, the flapper attire was very flat. And in fact, women did what they could to decentuate their breasts, and they bobbed their hair, and it was short. And it isn't to suggest that women, or at least the new woman, was attempting to be a man, but she is asserting her own dominance in a male-regulated society, in a male-dominated society. Here, women are de-accentuating their breasts, where in the Victorian era, the type of clothing would have accentuated it. In many ways, you can look at the flapper attire and recognize that she isn't just changing her clothes for the sake of it, right? Coco Chanel being a very significant player in this area in the 1920s. But really what she's doing is she's demonstrating through her clothing that these women are no longer going to be constrained by society. And the way that a corset constrains the body and tightens it together, well, this new clothing is freeing. We can talk more about that as we get into this content, but just recognize you have this image of the 1920s with us, of these new women smoking and drinking in speakeasies, these illicit nightclubs that were popping up because of the implementation of prohibition, which of course was put into place by the 18th Amendment, which made it illegal to manufacture and sell alcohol. That did not make it illegal to drink alcohol, and you just couldn't sell it or manufacture it. So if you could get it illicitly, then that was fine. This is, of course, where you get the speakeasies, where you get bootlegging, where you get rum running. In fact, NASCAR is a product of the prohibition, because what you had was a bunch of folks out in the backwoods who souped up their cars so they could outrun the cops as they're moving their moonshine. And then, of course, when the 21st Amendment came down in 1933, ending prohibition, they had these cars. Now, what do you do with them? Well, let's go make one giant left-hand turn all the time, and NASCAR is born. But the image of the 1920s as one of being, roaring and ballyhoo and the jazz age. I mean, in many ways, if the new woman is reflective of the personage of the 1920s, jazz is its soundtrack. And there's a lot of tension that exists, in fact, if you think about this, because jazz music is largely African-American music, right? It wasn't necessarily originated by white folks, but it was co-opted by white folks. In fact, you had a lot of white people who went into these speakeasies, these jazz clubs, to listen to jazz music. And it's interesting that what you would find is a bunch of white folks going into a predominantly African-American arena, listening to African-American music, and yet there aren't very many African-Americans participating in the enjoyment of that, although they may well be executing the music. And so there's a lot of interesting discussions to have about segregation and race tension and race relations in the 1920s when we start talking about jazz music and its impact upon American society. It states here that Louis Armstrong, an inspired trumpeter with a unique froggy voice, was the Pied Piper of jazz, an inventive and freewheeling performer who reshaped the American music scene. Born in New Orleans shack in 1900, the grandson of slaves, he was abandoned by his father and raised by his prostitute mother. Then he found music, using his natural genius to explore the fertile possibilities of jazz. Right? It says the culture of jazz quickly spread from its origins in New Orleans, Kansas City, Memphis, and St. Louis to the African-American neighborhoods of Harlem and New York City and Chicago's South Side. It actually ends up in Los Angeles as well, in Central Avenue. A jazz scene hits there. And jazz contributes to this larger view, right? These syncopated rhythms. And I think what you find with these folks, these individuals who are engaging in jazz and engaging in sexual liberation, among other things, is they are coming to a place where they're trying to realize what society should be. I mean, World War I punctured reality, as one historian would state, and many people came to conclude that we should not live by the values and morals of the Victorian age, of the tradition, right? Because what World War I taught everybody was that life is rough, life is difficult, and you could be dead tomorrow. So live life to the fullest. Eat, drink, and be merry, because you might die tomorrow. And so you need to live it up now. But that type of living, that type of mentality struck a chord with more traditionalist views. And what you're going to find in the 1920s is that modernism is not going to be not unchecked. Modernism is going to be checked by traditionalism. And you're going to see this traditionalism rise up as Christian fundamentalism. In fact, one of the major court cases of the time period was the Monkey Scopes trial. This, of course, dealt with the ability of folks to teach evolution versus creationism from the Bible. You're also going to see traditionalism sort of rise up in a group that we refer to as nativists and nativism. We've talked about this in the past. In fact, during the 1920s, you see this. There's a resurgence, if you will, of the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1920s, you very much find that folks begin to fear immigrants. There's a rising move of immigrants, the new immigrant. We've talked about them. And so there's this additional pushback against modernistic culture by these nativists and these traditionalists who want to maintain a sense of identity that is familiar to them, whether that's Christian beliefs, whether that's, for the KKK, their warped sense of reality, which would be a all-white America in some regards. And of course, what we mean by whiteness shifts from time to time. But you definitely see this tension. And there are other tensions as well. As it states here, racism also continued to limit the freedom of women. It says, for example, in 1990, an interracial couple from Ayer, Massachusetts, which was Mabel Puffer, a wealthy college graduate, and Arthur Hazard, a handyman, they decided to get married in Concord, New Hampshire. It says they checked into separate rooms in a hotel, then walked 3 blocks to the courthouse to apply for a marriage license, only to be told that there was a 5-day waiting period. So they waited and made preparations. And ultimately, the mayor of Concord agreed to perform the service. It says, unfortunately, though, the mayor of Concord announced he could not perform the wedding because of their race. So it's not just nativism, it's racism, it's traditionalism, it's a great deal of fear that people see. But the 1920s is incredibly significant, not only for the larger idea that we remember about it, whether that's the Roaring Twenties or this resurgence of nativism, which I think is very helpful in understanding contemporary arguments and debates about immigration. But you also see some really important cultural developments. You think of some places like the Harlem Renaissance and just the impact that had. Again, reading from it, it says, so many African Americans converged in New York City during the 20s that they inspired the Harlem Renaissance, the nation's first black literary and artistic movement. It started in the community of Harlem in northern Manhattan. In 1890, 1 in 70 people in Manhattan had been African American. By 1930, it was 1 in 9. And the reason for that is a great migration that is going to happen where many blacks in the South are going to leave. And here you get some really amazing poets and artists. You think of people like Langston Hughes and others who are really kind of pushing into society. And in many ways, they're fighting back, and they're fighting against racist, assimilationist, and segregationist ideas that black people have no culture of their own, or that black people can't contribute to society. It goes on to state, in poetry and prose, Harlem Renaissance writers celebrated African American culture, especially jazz and the blues, which featured deep emotional roots in black history. As Langston Hughes wrote, quote, I am a Negro and beautiful. The night is beautiful, so are the faces of my people. And what's interesting about Langston Hughes and others is that they are sort of, at least in this particular piece, is they're sort of identifying something that's going to come up later in a much more militant way, and that is the Black is Beautiful, the Black Power movement. And so, again, I think when we look at the 1920s, we need to understand that it lays a lot of roots that, had the Great Depression not happened, I think those roots would have developed much deeper and much sooner and created unique changes. But as we will see, of course, the 1920s was a time of economic prosperity, but in some regards, we were too prosperous. We overproduced. There was an unequal distribution of wealth. There was poor banking practices going on in the 1920s, and these things contribute, of course, to the Great Depression. And the Great Depression sort of puts a halt to some of the momentum created by the 1920s. Of course, then that's immediately followed by World War II. And so I think it's interesting and not really coincidental that a lot of what you find going on in the 1950s, late 40s, 1950s, parallels changes going on in the 1950s. This isn't to say that the 1950s and the decade of that time really sort of just picked up where the 1920s left off. But if that kind of thinking helps you when we finally get to the 1950s, then so be it. So I could go on and on and on, but of course I'm already past my 15 minutes. But hopefully this is helpful. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.